Okay, welcome everyone to our live briefing on aligning CT with efforts to preserve long-term justice and accountability in Afghanistan. My name is Tanja Mera and I lead the rule of law responses to terrorism work at ICCT. So just a few words about the International Center for Counter-Terrorism, for those of you who are not familiar with our work. We are based in The Hague, and we address countering terrorism and preventing violent extremism. And what we basically do is we conduct evidence-based research, and we contribute to the development of good practices, and we also provide policy advice. And in addition, we carry out trainings for policymakers, practitioners, and also for academics. And what we also do is we contribute to the public debate by organizing in-person events and live briefings like this one today. So I'm very pleased all of you have joined, because we have a very interesting live briefing today. So 20 years ago, ICCT was certainly not even created that time when the war on terror started. And the Taliban were ousted out of power. So after the fall of Afghanistan last year, while the Taliban was already designated 2 decades ago, has now become the de facto government. And what we have seen, ICCT has been, since last year, also contributing and conducting research, and has published a series of papers and perspectives and research papers, ranging on topics such as the public policy and the PR behind the Taliban, but also the regional impact it has since the Taliban is now back in power. We also looked at topics such as the spoils of war and how small arms and light weapons are being used by the Taliban for different purposes. And we have also reflected back on the so-called promises of the Taliban once they were in power for 1 year. So the Special Rapporteur for Afghanistan, Richard Bennett, he started his work in April of 2022, and he has already published his first report 2 months ago, in which he describes the dire situation and violations of human rights, in particular of women and girls. And this range from having no access to education and being limited to go to public places, restrictions on travel, child marriages, but also violence against women. What we have also seen is the shrinking space for civil society, and also the rapid dismantling from democratic institutions, which are detrimental to achieve long-term justice. The ongoing conflict has led to serious human rights violations. So while the Taliban has announced amnesty for the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, many of them are actually being killed or are disappeared. The situation of the minorities has also deteriorated, and this not only includes minorities such as the Hazaras, but also Christians, Hindus, Sikhs, and people of other faiths. This violence is not only being committed by the Taliban, but also by other actors in Afghanistan, such as ICCT. So today we have with us Megan Mannion, and I'm very pleased that she is here with us online. And Megan Mannion is a senior researcher at the Human Rights Center at the University of Minnesota at the law school. And in addition, she's a senior legal advisor to the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights while countering terrorism. But above all, I would like to highlight that Megan has in fact been our first Rule of Law visiting fellow this year, and she has spent approximately 3.5 weeks in October in The Hague with us. And during this period, we got to know her a little bit better and the work that she's been doing, and allowed and created an opportunity for her to conduct some research. And out of this research, there will be a policy brief coming out pretty soon, dealing with the topic of today. So I'm very pleased to give the floor now to Megan. We will have a presentation for approximately 20 to 25 minutes. Afterwards, we will have a Q&A session, and I encourage all of you to post your questions in the Q&A, and we will try to address as many questions as we can during this live briefing. So I'd like to hand over the floor to Megan.
Thank you, Tanya. And thanks to ICCT for organizing the webinar, and to all the colleagues who've joined. As Tanya said, I joined ICCT as a visiting fellow to work on this policy brief, and it's really been a pleasure to do so. I really think the opportunity to be a visiting fellow supported the time and ability for me to engage with Afghan civil society and experts whom I've worked with in Afghanistan, and who I continue to work with in my current functions as a senior research fellow, and also as a senior legal advisor to the Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism and Human Rights. Before I start, I would just like to make a small caveat that I have produced the policy brief in my capacity as a senior research fellow with the Human Rights Center, as Tanya presented. And while I serve as the senior legal advisor to the Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism and Human Rights, the views I express in the paper and here today do not necessarily represent the views of the mandate. So for this initial segment of the discussion, I hoped to present the policy brief, some of the key elements related to its arguments, with the aim of saving significant time for discussion and to hear from those of you who've joined us. So I'll start just giving a brief overview of some of the key factors and issues that are raised in the report. So in looking at the analysis produced since the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan in 2021, and Tanya has already examined some of this in the introduction, the policy brief really situates itself within the context of the analysis that's taken place since then. So analysts have traced the vacuum in the country for human rights documentation and accountability. They've looked at some of the daunting implications for the de facto authorities' decimation of domestic institutions, and outlined the complexity of the ways forward towards the full scope of human rights protections, rule of law, implementation, as well as security objectives. I think thorough examination of the current situation in Afghanistan, however, should also include, and this is central to the policy brief, a reflection of the ways in which counterterrorism policymakers and practitioners can and should course correct away from some of the problematic legacies of the last 20 years. In the policy brief, I underscore that really that counterterrorism, the counterterrorism field in general, but policymakers and practitioners have an opportunity to recalibrate their engagement with other fields of violence prevention at the field's disposal, including qualitative and quantitative evidence on the drivers of terrorism and insecurity, specifically those factors linked to these important issues of lack of accountability and impunity, but also linked to the root causes of conflict and multi-generational grievances within Afghan society, and the complex social and political webs that have generated the types of gross violations of human rights we're discussing. I think in the context of the policy brief, I really do make the argument that in this field, counterterrorism practitioners, policymakers, and political actors such as member state representatives in political spaces, including the UN Security Council and the Counterterrorism Committee, do have yet to pivot away from the narrow pathways that facilitated some of these grave costs for the security and human rights of Afghans. So with this in mind, the policy brief focuses on what I would say is the continued primacy of the counterterrorism lens for state multilateral responses to the situation in Afghanistan, and the connected implications for long-term justice and accountability. I highlight how the continued discussion at the international level remains framed in underlying dichotomies of counterterrorism and international security, in my view, versus, I would say, are juxtaposed to the prioritization of human security and the rights of the Afghan people. The brief itself does aim to demonstrate how the legacy and this, I would say, continued misalignment of counterterrorism and international-centric security priorities when it's paired with the lack of investment in long-term justice and accountability, may threaten to undermine the effectiveness of policies that could otherwise contribute to improvements in this area in Afghanistan, despite some of the very challenging circumstances that Tanya has highlighted already in the introduction. And I think while the brief focuses on the role of counterterrorism experts and practitioners in multilateral spaces, much of the analysis and recommendations are applicable to those at a bilateral or regional level. So as you can see on the slide here, the policy brief covers 3 sections. First, the brief makes the case that the legacy of counterterrorism in Afghanistan continues to rest in somewhat of a disconnect between international security priorities, rule of law, and the rights of the Afghan people. It also asks in section 2 whether a large-scale reassessment of international counterterrorism and its approaches are possible for Afghanistan, in part because the ways in which counterterrorism and prioritization of issues in Afghanistan occurs is part of a broader system of political decisions and momentum in the field of counterterrorism, with Afghanistan being a central case study and an important one, but also subject then to the challenges of addressing the larger issues in a larger thematic way. Section 3 really focuses on recommendations and paths for counterterrorism actors, primarily in the immediate and through existing pathways towards greater support to human rights and rule of law-based approaches, looking at how counterterrorism discourse continues to drive international discussion and approaches, and therefore what the obligation of counterterrorism actors and opportunities might be to take some of the lessons learned of the last 20 years and change some of the ways of doing business. For the remainder of the presentation, I'm going to just give a little bit of the detail into some of the arguments and issues that drive the analysis in each of the sections. But again, they'll just be overviews. So I'm really happy to take questions and dig deeper into any of these issues that are of interest to participants. So I think for section 1, I think for many of us here today, I can see that a number of us participants include those working on Afghanistan, but also working on counterterrorism, human rights, and other issues related. So I think amongst us, there's likely little doubt that the security challenges, which encompass local, national, regional, and international dimensions, really remain persistent in Afghanistan. And since the Taliban takeover, resounding calls have been made for the international community, particularly engaged states, such as the United States, to rethink security and counterterrorism strategies, including calls to avoid, quote, falling into past patterns of supporting proxies or, quote, pounding their enemies from the air. I think the precise pitfalls of the last 20 years of counterterrorism are exposed by these calls in a way where we see the financial and logistical support to non-state armed groups as proxies for foreign policy advantages, contributing to greater insecurity. We see the use of airstrikes, including but not limited to targeting of so-called high-value individuals. We see relaxed and ebbing and flowing rules of engagement. And importantly, for this policy brief, we've seen the pairing or conflation of military operations, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, stabilization, institution building, peace building, humanitarian, and development-looking mandates all coming together to create the current situation. The problems, I think, are therefore really clearly situated within the porous bounds between what counterterrorism was or was not in Afghanistan, which is largely focused in what the policy brief argues on what Western liberal democracies have selected as strategic for their external or internal use, often categorizing these porous bounds as integrated approaches, where others might see them as encroachment on governance, rule of law, development, and humanitarian assistance or peace building. The policy brief looks at this quite in depth and takes a look at some of the ways in which these features of the interventions, support, and efforts in Afghanistan have contributed to the current situation. In addition, I think the lack of clear strategy or convolution of missions within the United States' approach, as well as that of NATO, has secured this legacy in a way with paired rhetoric of waging a military response to this political threat of terrorism. I think in the policy brief, the way I frame it is really around what you could call this sort of 20-year myth of separability. The reality being that how the international community has viewed, and in my view, still views Afghanistan, is through the global counterterrorism lens, which in turn hinders really all other possible imaginations of how to promote and protect human rights while working towards greater security. And this is something I think in the context of the brief and in the context of my discussions with civil society partners, international security experts, and others in preparing the brief really came through. The section, I think, continues to reflect on the urgent need for reorientation and why that should be a priority for states, as well as for counterterrorism policymakers and practitioners, and how the disconnect between counterterrorism strategies and policy with lessons learned over the course of various operations in Afghanistan have not been fully taken up. Ultimately, I argue that the continued approaches of counterterrorism institutions have left open questions as to what exactly those lessons learned have been. And I think one of the very interesting things for me, and one of the things you don't often get time to do as a researcher, is to take a long-term historical view of the types of policy analysis and recommendations that have been made over the course of 2 decades. And I think one of the very interesting pieces of this policy brief for me was looking in particular at research from a range of actors from 2001 today, where you can really see how the recommendations that are still being made today across a wide range of actors really map onto and are consistent with recommendations that had been made and research and evidence that had been produced as early as 2003. And so I think it's one of the benefits of having the opportunity to undertake a visiting fellow role and dig into this, but it also, I think, is emblematic of some of the challenges of changing the direction of the field in a way. The section 1, I think, really closes and digs deeper for those of you who may be interested in this aspect into examining national level ad hoc reviews within NATO countries of how they've assessed and reviewed their own interventions and support in Afghanistan, as well as research among experts, including military, counterterrorism, as well as peace building, human rights, and gender experts that have contributed to an evidence base over the last 20 years. And to this point about the longevity of the recommendations and the type of analysis on the drivers of terrorism and conflict in Afghanistan since 2001, the section does also engage with looking at the monitoring team on Afghanistan's reports as early as 2001, which again bring us back to the repetition over the last 20 years, where we have as early as 2001 the UN Security Council's monitoring team already looking at conditions conducive to violence and noting that some of the key elements driving the insecurity and the current situation at the time continue to be situated around issues of governance, rule of law, and human rights. So for section 2, and Anushree, if you could move to just section 2 slide, that'd be great. Section 2 really focuses on what we've seen over the last, in the immediate period since the fall of the government of Afghanistan, and really looks at how the sense of emergency, I think rightly so, after the fall of the government and the following months was really rightly focused on the life-saving needs of the Afghan people and ensuring continuity for delivery of impartial humanitarian aid. It looks at some of the also corresponding security incidents, including the attack on Hamid Karzai Airport, which injured or killed around 300 civilians, mostly Afghans, and 28 military personnel. And also looks at how the Taliban, as the de facto authorities, have been or have not, as Tanya outlined in the introduction, been fulfilling the full scope of Afghanistan's obligations under international human rights law. I think section 2, part 2 of the paper takes a little bit of stock of the current political reality, which in part, and this links to some of the issues around long-term justice and accountability, was shaped by a central agreement between the United States and the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan in the context of negotiating an agreement that was entirely absent any rights holders between the Taliban, without even the political recognition of the United States, and to great lengths to underscore that lack of recognition, which in my view, and I think in many others, set sort of the course because of the lack of preconditions for human rights, including for women, and no agreed terms for next steps towards an intra-Afghan dialogue. I think the current despair over the lack of possibilities for long-term justice and accountability are inextricably linked to this systemic exclusion and lack of accountability. And of course, this links to the most recent agreement between the US and the Taliban. But there's extensive research on past peace agreements, ceasefire arrangements, humanitarian access arrangements, and other types of political negotiations that have taken place and siphoned out issues of accountability and rule of law, ostensibly with the argument being that the immediate needs were to stop violence and to come to some sort of a political arrangement to stop fighting. Again, I think in the context of the analysis that exists across peace agreements, it equally, and human rights and rule of law, it equally exists around the engagement of women in these processes, and I think leaves us in a situation where the old arguments of stopping violence before addressing some of these deep-seated issues is at a critical point for being questioned. And among many of the experts, including Afghan experts, this sort of impunity trap, in quotes, has been at the forefront of some of the issues around justice and accountability. So I think, as Tanya highlighted, this section deals with the developments over the last 20 years, but also the current state of affairs for justice institutions in Afghanistan, which were documented quite fulsomely in the first and latest report of the UN Special Rapporteur on Afghanistan. And I think, taking a critical lens, looking at existing literature and analyses, I think this section highlights how some of the current state of affairs could have been was predicted, and specifically by those who have been excluded from those political processes. The narrow priorities and the failure to set preconditions have really been what, in my view and experience, particularly speaking with Afghan civil society actors, have secured the current state of affairs. As early as 2019, large groups of women civil society organizations in Afghanistan, in briefings to NATO, for example, and briefings to the US government, emphasized that, quote, a hasty withdrawal would jeopardize for Afghans the entire future of hard-won gains, such as women's constitutional rights and freedoms and democratic institutions. So I think what we see in the context of women's human rights issues, justice and accountability issues around institutions such as the Bar Association, the justice system itself, and the proliferation of informal justice mechanisms, given the de facto authorities' positionalities. These are all linked in a way that the policy brief argues must be addressed or packaged together when conducting any type of analysis that would seek to support an alternative or new path towards justice and accountability. I think for time's sake, I'll move to part three, but would be happy to dig a bit more into, depending on participants' interests, to section two's focus on the impact of sanctions and this this question about how humanitarian assistance and sanctions have been interfacing in a way that may impact some of the possibilities for justice and accountability. But in section three, which was really an integrated section looking at what in the context of these two, if the findings for section one and section two are really around charting a new course for the approach of counterterrorism policymakers and practitioners to address or contribute to long-term human rights and rule of law objectives. Section three really drives that analysis into concrete political and programmatic pathways forward. So section three makes recommendations looking at the role of the Security Council, the role of the Human Rights Council, as well as counterterrorism practitioners working within the United Nations system, including the UN Office of Counterterrorism and the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, and provides recommendations to counterterrorism practitioners at the international or domestic level. I think the recommendations with some of the most immediate links are really to the UN Security Council, in the sense that the work of the United Nations and really the work of member states on counterterrorism, including in Afghanistan, drives through the UN Security Council's efforts. And so there's three recommendations that cover sort of the issues of lack of reflection and the imperative for the Security Council to take a close review of the peace and security priorities in Afghanistan, including evidence-based strategies for those interventions, including sanctions, but also thinking through how their work more broadly can contribute to conditions that support greater access to justice, rule of law, and long-term accountability. It also looks, as Section 2 did, at the humanitarian exemption that was provided last year in December to the situation in Afghanistan, and takes the view that humanitarian exemptions across all sanctions regimes are really what's needed, in the sense that an entirely revised approach to how the sanctions regimes engage with the humanitarian sector, as well as humanitarian needs, should drive a solution in Afghanistan, not just 1 year humanitarian exemption for the specific country situation. And of course, the United Nations Security Council's role in supporting and preserving the role of the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan to continue its human rights monitoring. The recommendations to the Human Rights Council are specifically focused around the role of the Special Rapporteur on Afghanistan. And of course, as many colleagues here know today, there was extended momentum and discussion in the wake of August 2021 around what the appropriate type of mechanism would be in Afghanistan from the Human Rights Council to examine some of these issues. And after long political debate and an inability to negotiate a commission of inquiry or fact-finding mission, there was success in establishing a special rapporteur on Afghanistan with resources and the ability to conduct some additional and more extensive human rights monitoring. But again, there are limitations there. And so this recommendation really speaks to that. I'll stop here and say that the recommendations to the UN, its counterterrorism entities, are really focused, I think, actually within the context of what we've seen across the UN system by way of reform and momentum over the last 20 years. And that links to counterterrorism. But I actually think in parallel, some pushes around how we think about conflict, how we understand conflict, and the types of evidence that are required to respond to conflict and violence, including terrorism, have to be rethought. And in some ways, I think the policy brief argues that there's been an insulation of the counterterrorism field from these developments, including integrating gender and conflict analysis together and respectively, looking at evidence-based approaches to program interventions, and thinking through what it means to have this dual system in the UN counterterrorism architecture related to the support of the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate to member states, particularly when we anticipate seeing increased regional investment from those entities. Not within Afghanistan, of course, because of their stated prioritization and concern about sanctions, but in the region. And so really looking at what it means for the UN to be engaging on counterterrorism, providing resources to the region around border security and law enforcement, and sanctions when the primary concern is within the territory of Afghanistan. So thinking through how counterterrorism entities can consider and think about their work from the perspective of their beneficiaries being centrally situated within Afghanistan and among the Afghan people. So looking at their obligations to think of Afghans as rights bearers, and through the lens of what their role is in the region. So I think I'll stop there, Tanya, and we can open it up to questions, or I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Megan, for the presentation. I have loads of questions, and I also got in quite a few questions. So thank you very much. Just to start with on the last point you were raising, this lack of integration, around the pairing of military operations, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism with other key areas, like peace building, institution building, humanitarian aid and development work, as you mentioned. what would you recommend how this could be remedied? Could you give some examples, small or big, because this is not the first time that we are hearing this also in the context of other conflicts, like in the Sahel, that there is this lack of integration. So keen to hear your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Tanya. Should I answer that question now, or would you like me to answer?
No, I think just answer them now, and then I will weave in some of the other. I'm sorting them out and making sure they're a bit, together. So then I have a couple of questions on the accountability aspect. So please go ahead.
Great, thank you. No, I think that's a very good question. The policy brief really delves deep into this, in part because there's so many existing recommendations, in particular related to how the UN's counterterrorism architecture should be responding to and understanding of their role within the context of other priorities. And I think the policy brief grapples with the difficulty of a field of practice recognizing that sometimes their work operates with what I would say is a blunt force, and can, if analyzed properly and thought through, can, from sort of an initial conceptual inception phase, understand how their interventions and support can quell opportunities for other frameworks, rights-based frameworks, obligations, but also some of these priorities around humanitarian assistance, peace building, some of these areas of work and tools where we have substantial evidence that they work. And so I think the recommendation I closed on was really for thinking through how that can be accomplished in a way that within the limits of the system and with the lessons learned from the past about this concept of integration between CT and convolution of CT with other initiatives can be conducted in a way that's really thought out. So I think that is why, like, the complexity of this question is why I've made recommendations around sort of a UN system review of peace and security priorities in Afghanistan. I think one of the primary concerns of the policy brief are is around how the trajectory of counterterrorism writ large over the last 2 years, really since the fall of the government of Afghanistan, within the UN has not taken a critical view or review of the work that it's conducted or the impact of counterterrorism in the country. And so I actually think as a starting off point, there needs to be some internal reckoning with what those positive or negative contributions have been and what their interface has been with other priorities of the UN, including peace building, women's rights, women, peace and security, and other areas. So I think in a first instance, there really needs to be a commitment internally to taking a look at this. I think this comes through in the policy brief in the sense that there are many reports from international civil society organizations as well as Afghan civil society organizations that have called for a decrease in the investment in counterterrorism and a prioritization of investments in other work, including peace building, but also including women, peace and security. And I think that in the context of the policy brief and in the context of the UN system, sometimes that's not the most popular view to take. And so what we have in the policy brief, I think, is this call to respond to the evidence that we have about what works. And so if we pair the need for an immediate review of the UN's engagement on CT in Afghanistan and in the region with an analysis and mainstreaming of the evidence we have about what works to contribute to less violence in particular countries, including in Afghanistan, we would likely come out at a different conclusion about where dollars spent in Afghanistan should go and how they should work to secure not just the international security priorities of member states, but also be measured against their contribution to the conditions in the country. And so I think in some of my discussions with interlocutors, particularly on where the UN is going in Afghanistan, but in the region, there has been just a de facto move. And I say de facto in the sense that it's scaling up without this type of analysis I've just raised of support to the region. And that's specifically on border security and law enforcement. It specifically includes increasing the use of technologies to increase the efficacy of those border management and law enforcement processes. And I think the concern for me in the policy brief and certainly among others conducting research on this is around what that type of work means when there isn't, for example, a human rights-based analysis of the impact on the rights bearers related to the situation, specifically the Afghan people. And I think in the context of the policy brief, one of the examples is this juxtaposition of this type of investment with what we've seen in the context of the immediate movement of people outside of the country. So I think one of those questions that would be asked but isn't being asked is, what does it mean to increase border management and law enforcement without an analysis of its impact on the rights of Afghans, including around international refugee law? And so those are some of the dichotomies and some of the challenges that would come up if these types of analyses were undertaken, and if there was a reframing of the stakeholders for the UN's counterterrorism work as the beneficiaries being the Afghan people and not securing the states within the region or the international community.
Yeah, no, I mean, while I recognize the need to improve border management, which is also a very tangible way of making a contribution, and are also focusing on monitoring more closely the activities online. I'm wondering whether, when we are talking about recalibration of CT efforts, whether there should not be a more focus on the drivers of violent extremism and that we focus more on the root causes. Do you think that would be helpful as we move forward instead of only looking at like so-called the more hard CT measures?
Thanks, Tanya. So I think the policy brief does address this in the sense that if we look at that, somehow the work no longer becomes CT. And so I think the question the policy brief asks is where that investment should go, and whether and how we move away from framing the situation in Afghanistan as a counterterrorism problem in general. And so I think the main question I'm asking counterterrorism policymakers and practitioners in the policy brief is about, if you were to look at this extensive literature on the impact of CT in Afghanistan, but also in other places, and also look at the evidence base around the prevention of violence, would the tools they advance solve the problem, and are they the appropriate actors to solve these problems? And I think many people and many of the research pieces that I cite and engage with in the policy brief would say no. And so I think there's a difficult conversation and a priorities conversation, a sequencing conversation to be had, because again, I think there's wide agreement about the international security risks, and there's wide agreement about the domestic and regional security risks. But I think the question is how you get at all of these challenges without the blunt force of a counterterrorism approach prioritization above all impacting the priorities for peace building, of course, but I think in the context of this paper, another 20 years of not thinking about what long-term justice and accountability means in Afghanistan. And I think one of the elephants in the conversation is around the somewhat just the lack of political will to look at where and how the rights violations in Afghanistan have come from. And so there's a complexity of actors, there's a complexity of drivers of violence, and there's a complexity of pathways for each of those issues to be addressed. And so I did see in the chat the question around pathways for long-term justice and accountability and around these rights violations. And there's distinct paths for each of these pieces, some more possible than others because of the political drivers of the overall situation.
Yeah, no, this is exactly the segue. I wanted to move into more the accountability issues. Because we indeed have several questions relating to that. So one of the participants is indeed asking, saying, given the consistent stance of civil society on the need for past accountability for both victims of terrorism and victims of counterterrorism, you say there are indeed different paths, but maybe you could expand a little bit more on that. And I also wanted to add, in addition to that, if you can take into account, I'm sure you are also well aware that the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has announced this week that he will be visiting Afghanistan next week. And we all know that they will be looking at crimes that have been committed not by all actors, but specifically only by the Taliban. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on this also, and how far will this contribute to achieving long-term justice, not from our perspective, but also what do you think according to the Afghan people themselves? And then maybe the third point that I wanted to raise is in how far should we consider other forms of transitional justice next to the criminal justice response to be explored. I mentioned briefly that the Taliban had, issued, amnesties, but it doesn't have, it has a lot of problems with it, but maybe you could reflect and expand a little bit more on your thoughts on these different efforts that are being taken on the accountability.
Great, thanks. And thanks to participants for the question. So on the question of accountability, specific to how it might be advanced in the immediate, I think so. In the context of my introduction, I framed part of the paper around how the continued focus on counterterrorism has prevented the international community from taking having a wider imagination about how to think about the situation in Afghanistan. And I think my impressions from some of the conversations I had preparing the policy brief were that, and this includes a number of civil society actors who've worked in country on trying to advance victim participation in the peace process, victim participation and access to reparation and other forms of repair. And in the context of the fall of the government of Afghanistan, asking and having conversations about what it meant for all of those institutional efforts to go away. I think the continued counterterrorism lens has also, and this is within the policy brief, prevented us from having or framing our conversation around the types of violations we see in Afghanistan as international crimes, and from seeing really thinking through and prioritizing access to justice in a way that we see in other contexts. So the levels of violence, for example, and the ways in which one attack occurs and another attack occurs, and we don't actually follow up on or frame the victims, particularly Afghan victims, as rights bearers in the context of long-term justice and accountability efforts, I think is quite tangible, particularly when we have some of these conversations in the international level. On the ICC visit, I mean, this your point speaks to the complexity, given that the prosecutor will return to continue looking at crimes from one perspective. And again, this goes to my last point about the complexity of the political situation in the context of the ICC not looking at crimes of international actors. And I think that distorts the long-term picture of what the violations have been. And in the immediate, it doesn't, that won't change with the ICC. But I think when that was originally announced, I'm forgetting the year, when that was originally announced that the investigation would limit its focus, and then the deferral to the government of Afghanistan took place, there was a significant pushback from international diasporic and national civil society organizations. So I think the reality is that the levels of documentation and the movement among civil society to push for a different type of solution will not go away. But again, I think we will continue having this conversation without a concrete pathway for some time to come. I think many are interested in what a visit of the prosecutor will look like in terms of his engagement with the de facto authorities. And so it does seem quite unprecedented, and I think I don't have a clear answer on what that will look like. And I will say to the question around how accountability might be advanced in the immediate, many of the individuals I spoke to are politically and strategically focusing on documentation and preserving any ability to monitor the human rights violations that are taking place, particularly in the context of limited access to international media, limited sort of freedom among journalists to report and cover certain types of violations. And so in the immediate, from what I understand, and this is both from international and Afghan civil society organizations, is that is a political priority in terms of the work that the UN and the international community can undertake in the immediate.
Thank you, Megan. Yeah, no, I mean, it's a very complex issue, the accountability, and the crimes indeed have been committed not only by different actors, but also during different time frames. So it is not a one-fit-all solution. I still have a few questions more related to the fact that the Taliban are now, whether we like it or not, are, the de facto government. And one of the questions which has been raised is whether CT efforts should start engaging with the de facto government, meaning a Taliban, to put a strategy in place to wipe out ICCT and other non-state actors. Obviously with some tailored conditions to Taliban, so in a way to improve their governance and help them to act responsibly. What do you think about that? Do you think that that is something we should consider?
It's a great question, and I think it's actually much more. It's a much more broad question than even has been presented, in the sense that the conversations about the Taliban's international legal obligations has been one that has been raised, I think, since day one of their role as de facto authorities. Yeah. And it's been raised particularly in the Security Council by women civil society organizations from Afghanistan, asking the international community, for example, to ensure that the Taliban is held to the same standards as other member states, in the sense of their obligation to implement the international legal commitments of the government of Afghanistan. And so there's been pressure on the international human rights law side to continue to hold them accountable to those obligations, including under those frameworks and processes. And this question did arise in some of my conversations with CT policymakers and practitioners, including those working at an international level. And I think part of the questions that were raised to me in the context of what this might look like were specifically around the de facto authorities' obligations to comply with international counterterrorism obligations and frameworks, and whether and how, for example, the UN Security Council and its mechanisms would be engaging with the de facto authorities. I think we are far away from a solution to that, and I think the question of not only recognition, but how and if ever the UN Security Council and other mechanisms would engage with the de facto authorities is one that won't be answered for some time. And again, I think the challenge here is around the preconditions for that type of engagement. And again, the prioritization of international human rights law obligations have been at the center of some of the advocacy on this issue. I think from a kinetic standpoint, and the way in this question is framed is around, I think, sort of that technical assistance and capacity building, the actual physical support to counterterrorism. And I actually think the policy brief itself, in the way in which it frames some of the high risk natures of those types of support, holds significantly too much risk, but also at the current legal space would be a violation of international sanctions regimes. So I think currently the international legal framework prevents this type of engagement, and I think for good reason, particularly around international human rights law obligations, international humanitarian obligations. And so I think we're really at a stage of more political discussion about compelling and working within those legal frameworks. And I would say in a way that they were designed. So the sanctions regimes applicable to the Taliban has always been conceived of as a tool to engage the authorities in Afghanistan in working towards a peace process and working towards larger solutions to the conflict in Afghanistan, not only just counterterrorism. And so I would be more interested to put efforts into advancing that type of dialogue and considering how to move some of the governance issues through political discourse rather than this type of approach. But I would also refer this colleague to Ben Saul's ICCT report, which focuses on engagement with the Taliban and the sort of mixed models that are available to on a diplomatic and practical level. And I would also refer this person, there are interesting conversations happening on this issue, particularly the International Crisis Group's recent policy brief on the situation in Afghanistan deals specifically with this issue, and also doesn't have a conclusion, but raises some of the specific human rights and rule of law challenges, and charts somewhat of a way forward, but with significant reservations about what that would mean.
Thank you, Mia, and also for the suggestions where to look for more information. And I know there have been also some reports, whether or not working together and sharing intelligence has also been raised. I mean, especially when it comes to keep track on ISKP, and that it does raise indeed a lot of concerns. I just wanted to follow up a little bit more on the fact that, I mean, you mentioned it, and in the UN, they also keep on mentioning it, since the Taliban are the de facto government, they are responsible for upholding the international legal obligations, in particular also the human rights obligations. And I've seen in the report of the special rapporteur that he has a long list of recommendations addressed to the de facto government, which is the Taliban. I think it's the ABC, I can't even count it big, but it goes all the way up to O. So it are quite a significant long list of recommendations. But then I wonder, what is their incentive to abide by them? I mean, I think that is one of the questions we also need to ask ourselves. I mean, we can stipulate the violations. I mean, and there have been a lot of reports which indicate what the violations are, and we can, we can explain what the obligations are under international law, but how? So, I mean, and I understand, of course, if you don't have a full answer, but I'm just curious to hear your thoughts, especially because you have been talking also with civil society in and outside of Afghanistan. What is the incentive for the Taliban to abide by these obligations?
Thanks, Tanya. So I think a number of the conversations early on in late 2021 really focused on this recognition question, which brings us actually back to the last question in a way. And I think the somewhat initial read may have overly simplified what many analysts know to be true about the Taliban, and also know to be true about the positions they hold within and amongst different parts of the Taliban. And this was true in the context of peace negotiations and what was being presented at the table and what was able to be negotiated in country. But I think the question about how far their desire for international recognition takes them towards compliance with some of these very concrete asks, including from the special rapporteur and other mandate holders on international human rights law obligations. And I think in the context of this discussion about the sanctions regimes and what they are designed to do, again, I think the ways in which focusing on counterterrorism limits that conversation has been observed over the last 2 years. So I think the presumption that international recognition, for example, would drive some compliance, including with particularly counterterrorism frameworks or priorities, was a bit premature. And if you were to look, for example, at those doing conflict analysis and looking at the Taliban from a more complex political perspective, including as they do other non-state armed groups, including those designated at the UN level, you would have a significantly more complex read on what some of their drivers may or may not be, and what some of the possibilities might be for compliance at varying levels, both in capital, but also at different regional sort of centers of control. So I think as the special rapporteur on Afghanistan has framed his recommendations, despite, and again, this speaks to the prospects for accountability, despite some of the bleak landscape for compliance and despite some of the bleak landscape for concrete pathways forward, the continued pressing on these obligations is actually a significant contribution to ensuring that when the time does come and political space may or may not open, and whether or not that can be facilitated at an international level, a regional level, or a bilateral level, that some of these pieces are in place to make those things possible. And so I really do think that that's the value of these types of recommendations being so fulsome, and sort of continuing their engagement in a consistent form to how Afghanistan as a member state to the UN has been engaged in the past. So I don't have a better answer on compelling their compliance, but I do think
I find it very compelling. So no, I mean, I think it's fair. I mean, enough to point out, maybe it's also taking smaller steps than one would envision. So I think, I understand your point is that you have to be consistent and keep on calling them out and pointing them to their international legal obligations. So I would certainly think that is already, valuable, and that considering the complexities, that you can only expect also minor steps to be taken. It is not an easy situation to deal with. And I recall the discussions we had when you were here, that you were saying it is such a difficult topic, and it is so broad. There's so many aspects one could look at. So I perfectly understand that. I think we have one more question. I see if you may wish to answer that one. And then I think we have to slowly start winding down the live briefing. And I think it's about how the research reflects counterterrorism guidelines in Southeast Asia and Central Asia, and how the UN agencies could collaborate to include this more in their agenda, given that the countries are also suffering from effects of terrorism. So I think it's more integrating some of the regional guidelines into more the UN aspects.
Thanks, Tanya. So, well, I have some clarifying questions about this question, but I think in the context of this policy brief, there's less of an examination of the regional dynamics, particularly because there is an ICCT policy brief on some of the regional approaches to the issues in Afghanistan, which is a good resource on this question. But I actually think in the context of Afghanistan and this conversation we're having about long-term justice and accountability, we are specifically talking about the impact of terrorism on communities and individuals, in parallel to the impact of counterterrorism measures and their ability to solve these challenges. So I would say that taking this international human rights, humanitarian law, and refugee lens approach is actually responding to how communities are impacted by terrorism. And in the context of Afghanistan, as Tanya just said, this is really the complexity of the country situation and the complexity of the conflict in Afghanistan, because it is marked by violations of international law, including terrorism, but also by violations of international law linked to counterterrorism operations. And so I'm not sure how what counterterrorism guidelines in the region, which are being referred to here. But I would say that UN agencies, in the context of their rule of law, access to justice, peace building, and humanitarian work, are responding to the impact of terrorism as a central form of violence in Afghanistan. And so I'd be interested to know which guidelines in the regional space are being referred to here. But in the context of the UN's response, some of the core frameworks around those responses are linked to broader UN agendas. And so I'm not quite sure what regional guidelines. If the colleague is still with us, maybe they would like to include that in the Q&A or in the chat.
Let's see if we will get a response. But in any way, I want to thank you a lot for taking the time to being with us and to share your insights on how counterterrorism can be recalibrated in Afghanistan towards efforts to preserve this long-term justice and accountability. I would definitely recommend all the participants to stay tuned of the ICCT website, because Megan will be soon publishing her policy brief, and we will also make sure that those of you who have attended will receive an email tomorrow with also further reading on the different perspectives, policy briefs, and research papers that have been written by ICCT on Afghanistan. I think it's really very important to keep focusing and keep having this discussion on Afghanistan due to also the geopolitical situation. Sometimes the focus is already shifting to other regions, but I think we should not forget the situation in Afghanistan. So I'm very grateful that you took the time and the effort to write this policy brief, and I hope it will help CT experts, whether at national or regional or at international level, to think more closely about how, as we move forward, CT measures can be better aligned to achieve this long-term justice and accountability. So Megan, I would very much like to thank you for being here today with us. And it was a pleasure having you here as our first Rule of Law visiting fellow. And I look forward to seeing your policy brief coming out in the near future. So thank you very much. Oh, and before I sign off, I just wanted to remind the participants, we would very much like to continue hosting live webinars, and your feedback will be very useful so that we can make sure that we can improve our live briefings. And a recording of the live briefing will be also available on our YouTube channel. So once again, thank you very much, Megan. I give the floor to you for some last words.
Thanks, Tanya. And thanks to everyone who's joined. It's really been my pleasure to talk about the policy brief, but also really to develop it with ICCT. And again, it's just been a really rare opportunity to connect with colleagues from Afghanistan and to think through some of these really challenging issues. I think in the context of the policy brief, I look forward to feedback from those of you participating, and I'm very happy to stay engaged in discussion. So just thank you for joining, and I look forward to future opportunities to continue these discussions.
Okay, thank you very much, Megan. And on behalf of all of us at ICCT, thank you for attending, and we wish you a pleasant morning, afternoon, and evening. See you. Bye-bye.